Hello. I want to welcome you all here this evening. Those of you that are part of our MCAD community, and those of you that I see a lot of people that have come in to join us tonight. So it's so glad to have you come out on this really cold night for a really fabulous talk from Sheila Pepe. I'm Linda Monica Eisenberg. I'm acting chair of fine arts here at the college. And this evening, I'm really happy to present Christopher Atkins, who's curator of exhibitions and public programs at the Minnesota Museum of American Art. There's a unique partnership between Christopher Atkins at MMAA, or the M, and Michael Raddick from the American Crafts Council, and our own Natasha Pestich from MCAD Visiting Artists Committee. They're providing an opportunity to hear Sheila Pepe tonight. She's going to be preparing a commission installation at the Minnesota Museum of American Art's new sculpture court this spring when they reopen. So what I'd like you to do is give a warm Minnesota welcome to Christopher, who's going to introduce Sheila to Christopher and Sheila. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda, and thank you all for being here today. I just want to reiterate what Linda mentioned before, and to really say thank you to MCAD and to the American Craft Council for this partnership. It was a crazy idea a couple months ago, and that it's all happening now just feels really great. So I'm really glad that Sheila can be here and talk a little bit about that process. So thank you again, and I hope that it's something we can continue to do in the future. And thank you again for all you folks who are here, as Linda said, to come out on such a cold night to join us here tonight. And it's my honor to introduce Sheila. On Tuesday, September 6th of 2016 at 2:38 p.m., I wrote an email to Sheila Pepe asking if she would be available for a studio visit. I was going to be in New York in early November and was packing my schedule with meetings and studio visits. We had never met before or even talked on the phone, but I had seen her work in a recent exhibition in Des Moines and done plenty of online research, including all the videos that she's posted, reading press releases and articles, and found lots and lots of photos of her past work. I was really excited about it, and especially her interest in craft, drawing, and combinations with installation as well, too. It was a long and interesting career. She, however, had no idea who I was. I wasn't sure if I'd even get a response, but I had to put myself out there. And but a week later, on September 13th at 9:30 a.m., I did get a reply. It read simply, "Sure, 7, 8, or 11," meaning November 7th, 8th, or 11th. "Afternoon, my studio will be in Dumbo by then. Signed, S." Her signature was from my iPhone and chaos, which I thought was great. So judging by the number of exclamation points, I was excited that she was excited. When we finally met on Thursday, November 10th, New York, we were in New York, and the rest of the country was still reeling from a massive election night hangover. I hear your groans. You were all there with us, I know. Nonetheless, she opened her door with a wide smile and warm introduction to her studio. I had plenty to talk about. I had lots that I had prepared to say during this meeting. But that all disappeared when she said something along the lines of, "I never know how or what to prepare to say during these meetings." I knew we were going to cover a lot of territory, and we did. And over our 1+ hour meeting, I kept thinking about how that sense of improvisation, of responding to rather than controlling a situation, or just watching where this is going to go is so much a part of her work. I was really inspired by that. I saw it again and again. The more we talked and the more we laughed. We laughed a lot, I remember. The more I came to trust her and her work. And again, when it came time to plan for the opening exhibition for our new space, it was my pleasure to invite Sheila to make a new work for our sculpture court. And this is part of the reason why she's here with us today. Sheila Pepe is an artist and educator known for her large-scale ephemeral installations and sculptures made from domestic and industrial material through a self-described process she calls improvisational crochet. Since the mid-1990s, she has used lesbian, feminist, and craft traditions to investigate systems of power as she sees them in institutions of art as well as education. Born in Morristown, New Jersey, Pepe came from a lineage of craftspeople. Her grandfather was a shoemaker, and her maternal elders were skilled in crochet as well, too. She received a BFA from Massachusetts College of Art in Boston, 1983, and later an MFA at the School of the Museum of Fine Arts in 1995. She cites her family and the work of women before her as influences on her own practice, naming artists like Judy Chicago, Eva Hesse, Mira Shore, and Nancy Sparrow as inspirations. She has exhibited widely throughout the United States and abroad in solo and group exhibitions at venues including Smith College Museum of Art, PS1 MoMA, the Leslie Lowen Museum of Lesbian and Gay Art in New York, as well as the 8th Shenzhen Sculpture Biennial in China. She has received a number of awards, including an Art Matters Grant, a Joan Mitchell Foundation Artist Grant, and the Louise Comfort Timpany Foundation Award. As an educator, she trespasses the boundaries of fixed disciplines in art as well as design, and is currently a core critic at Columbia University. Her mid-career retrospective, Hot Mess Formalism, which if there was an award for exhibition titles, I think it gets the highest award. I love that title. Opened at the Phoenix Art Museum in October 2017 and will continue touring to the Everson Museum in Syracuse, New York, the Bemis Center in Omaha, Nebraska, and finally, the De Cordova Museum in Lincoln, Massachusetts. Finally, and partially this is why she's here, Sheila will premiere a new site-specific installation commissioned by the M that will be presented in our sculpture court when we open later in 2018. Please welcome Sheila Pepe.
Great.
Sure, you got it. Welcome.
Thank you. Sure. Thank you. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, okay. There are a lot of parts here. I just want to make sure I get the parts right. I've been shown the fancy way to do this, so. Let's see if I can figure this out. Okay, we're gonna have to play, So I'm about to show you some YouTube video, but I'm gonna watch the commercial and get it to the place where it says skip ad. Oh, I have a slight problem. Okay, hang in there with me, folks. Hey, tech guys. Thank you. I know I can slide this over, right? I want to play this, I want to slide it over. Yeah, that's it. That's the trick. All right, you did it. And then I'll just shut it and, yeah. And, watching a video the history of Central Asia every year, made by this fellow Ali Bai, who has amazing videos on YouTube. My guess is most of you don't really think much about Central Asia. But during the years that people who lived around the Mediterranean entered what we call the Dark Ages, it just so happened that most of Asia was not having a dark age. One of the things that I love about this map is that how many people can orient it in their mind on the globe. So, louder. Thank you. So when you go home tonight and you're streaming things on YouTube, find Ollie by Ollie, like Olliebye, and find all of the different animated maps that will put this one into context. I'm starting this way because when we make art and we study art history, and we might even study a subset of our own discipline like ceramics or textiles or painting or sculpture, we tend to do so far inside of our own cultural subset that we forget what it's connected to. And I have to say that in the last 2 or 3 years, I've only read and listened to histories, big global histories. In the past year especially, it seems very important to understand who we're really making enemies of. Not that we didn't before, but, hey. That kind of oblique look at everything that gets done is really important to my work. Now we will. Now I need my cursor back. Here we go. So I want to thank this collaboration of enterprises here, the museum, the school, the craft society. It's this kind of interaction between parts of people. Even, you'll see how I think about my work. It can happen quite obliquely. And there are always things in my work that are not so obvious. I think opaque is a word that I used this afternoon with one of the students. But there are other things that happen that are quite populist. And during the last presidential campaign, I was arguing stridently for the possibility of being a populist. And I realized it means something different in art than it might in general politics. So I might have to take that back. But this is some video from a project at CAM in Houston of one of the Common Sense series. And the idea behind this series of work was that I would provide a big modernist type of structure and design it in such a way that a simple pull on a strand of yarn, and this is all fingerling, that it was prepared for the children, they weren't children, the mothers of small children that were at a local house for young mothers, kind of an apartment setting for young mothers. This was, everybody showed up, but the idea was that you could make stuff for babies from this construction. So with a simple pull, you could unravel the materials you wanted and make things of your own from this. And in truth, this was an exercise that happened after several years of deciding that I was going to make the installations and I was going to decide that they were ephemeral and complete in my own way. So I had total control. And this was an exercise in losing control. So kind of opening things up to a type of unknown that was not an art unknown, but a homemaking or DIY or a giving materials back to the community conclusion. One of the things that I realized that it wasn't successful everywhere because the museum experience, or in fact the gallery experience, could be intimidating for people. But this was a great time, because the curatorial staff got it really involved and made sure that everybody knew it was okay by giving folks a title called Cocktails and Crochet. Okay. So I want to, with those two kind of aberrant beginnings, something that is intellectually interesting to me and where my mind is going way beyond the art world, and then this kind of commonplace event that happened at camp some years ago. I want to take you back to a kind of beginning of me understanding myself as an adult artist and what was really important to me. And I think it seems silly, but one of the most important things we do as artists is learn how to see, and learn how to see in a way that perhaps is a bit unusual or different than people who are not artists. It's one of the things that we can offer to the general community in seeing things differently, and then conveying through our work what that difference is. So this is one we probably all know. How many people recognize this image? And somebody shout out what the title of this image might be. Old lady, or yep, that's one. Old maid or young lady. Maid and crone, that's the other one. And you know, if you go back and remember the very first time you saw this, you know, I remember my first, it was my first encounter with a kind of, what I call maybe a perceptual ambiguity, where you could see one and then you really had to play around to find the other and shift focused or stare and something, or let the word crone or let the word young lady kind of, and it wasn't just any young lady. It was somebody that looked like she might be a dancing girl in Paris. It should be dancing girl in Paris and witchy lady with a babushka on it or something. You know, where that she has quite the nose, and she has a kind of collar, like a fluffy collar that she's got her chin stuck into, and it looks like she might be missing all of her teeth. But she has eyes. They're kind of hard to see, but they're there. Now, the young lady is turned away from us, so we can just see the tip of her nose and her ear. So the ear becomes the eye, right? And we can all see this now and dance around. And you can, sometimes I can just hold the whole thing in my head and not see anything. Just a bunch of marks, which is probably the most exciting thing of all. It's the language-less part. So in the 1990s, I started this project to kind of perform this very gesture, but in terms that I understood. I hadn't really made this connection until I started doing this talk to that image, right? But my interest was to do many things. One was to marry two things that some people told me weren't supposed to go together: abstract objects that were handmade and narrative drawings. They don't go together. But it was a simple operation that I knew what it was coming from. I wanted to put these two parts that seemed not to go together, and I also found that I could marry them together by this simple activity of lighting, making a little handmade light and shining the light onto the object, and create this kind of game that I thought of as naming as making. So the light goes on, and then the work really exists only by the virtue of this connection between the light and the shadow. And then immediately, as I saw a picture in the abstract shadow, and you know, it's like in the back of my mind, I'm thinking like this entire thing happens because I can plug this into the wall, and on the other side of that wall, there's this electrical grid that, you know, is required to make this whole thing happen. So I can't really do this completely alone. So I'm borrowing Con Ed as one of my collaborators. And the entire thing creates this relationship of like this contingent, specific event. It's the architecture, the grid, the object, the light, the shadow, and it all really unraveling before me. And that moment I look into the light or the shadow, it's the first thought of what do I see? And you know, there are no words in that moment. So it's just pencil to wall to fill in the picture that I can project in that shadow. And so the entire thing gets built so that the viewer has this dissonant buzz between the parts of the knowable, the nameable, the unnameable, the two-dimensional to the three-dimensional, back to the two-dimensional. And all of these kind of crazy differences of things. There's no relationship to the object and the shadow it makes and the identity that I've given that shadow. Except for there is a very concrete relationship between that object and those parts. And this idea of holding all of these differences together by this one act seemed amazing to me, and amazing that I could also hold it in the state of ambiguity, of not completely understanding what the relationships are. And to top it all off, to make the entire operation completely ephemeral. There is an image of the construction in full light. So, you know, the way I'd make objects, you know, all of this construction, and this is about 1994, is born of a good bit of ADD, undiagnosed, because in my youth, there was a stay in at recess is what it was called. Stay in at recess and practice your math speed, which made it even worse. Like, I can't do either one of those things. So it's like 5 minutes, 5 minutes, 5 minutes, and the objects for a long time got made above the waste container in the sculpture, one of the sculpture rooms at the museum school, where it'd be like, oh, that's a nice piece of old latex, and I've got my coffee, and I'll just pour out the coffee and put the plaster in the cup, and then I've got some tape in my pocket. And so these little gestures made and pieces put together, 5 minutes, then shadow, I see it, 5-minute drawing, and then there you have it. And these things grew. But always, no matter the size, it was understood that it was a one-time operation, never to be realized again in that exact configuration. And then it was made to be sure that all the objects accumulated were singular work. And it was solely about that experience and that momentary perception, as long as I could draw it out for my audience, with this dissonance of parts and tied together by the phenomena of a simple, seemingly binary relationship, a juxtaposition, if you will, of light and shadow. And it was all made to defy ownership, replication, and resale. In 1997, a colleague asked me, how can you stand destroying your work over and over again? And I said, well, I grew up in a family deli where work was play, and for me, play was work. I was always given a job. I was put on top of a Coke crate at the time, which was wood and metal, and my sleeves were rolled up to my armpits, and I was allowed to wash really big pots for as long as I wanted to, which was pretty amazing. And Mom kept me busy, and I had a job, which is what I feel like I still do. So I also I had the perfect work training. I had a familiarity with a product that there was a tremendous amount of labor and love and care given to. And then after it was experienced, we all know where that goes. And it gets flushed, and that's that. And it's all good. The only benefit for me was I could cannibalize all of my work and make it into new work. Plus, I would say that I grew up in the Second Vatican Council, a Roman Catholic Church, where we had this thing called transubstantiation, where we understood that ordinary things through a certain ritual could be made into something really special. And when I was younger, it was one thing, and then when I was older and left the church, it was just something else. I let art be that thing for me, and it continues to be. But there were other parts of that community that were about social justice and community service and a kind of place where the miracle and the everyday lived side by side. There were no miracles in my church. I'm just saying, like, as artists would metaphorically. So I think the other thing that's really important is learning thinking, not just how we think, but each of us as artists, as people, have this thinking thing we do that's not like anybody else's thinking. It comes from a wealth of experiences and education, and it changes over time. But I have to say that since the late 80s, in my education, I came across this idea of family resemblances, authored by a guy named Wittgenstein. And it just really stuck with me. And I would say that this is a pre-digital era when I find this thing. And I've grown up in the Roman Catholic Church, where there are a lot of laws, there are a lot of rules. And of course, my parents were very devout Catholics, and there were even more rules. And they're Southern Italian, so we could add some more rules. But I loved this idea that instead of producing something common to all things that we call language, she's saying that these phenomena, language, which she's talking about, and as artists, we can also talk about language or languages, they have no one thing in common, which makes us use the same word for all, the word language, but they are related to one another in many different ways, and because of this relationship or these relationships that we call them all language. Consider for example, the preceding we call games. Board games, card games, ball games, Olympic games, and so on. What is common to them all? Don't say there must be something common, or they would not be called games, but look and see whether there is anything common. For if you look at them, you will not see something that is common to all, but similarities, relationships, and a whole series of them at that. To repeat, don't think, but look. I love a philosopher who tells you to look. I can think of no better expression to characterize these similarities than family resemblances, for the various resemblances between members of a family, build, features, color, size, gait, temperament, etc., overlap and crisscross in the same way. And I shall say games form a family, and we extend our concept of number as in a spinning thread, as in spinning a thread. This is for the textile mafia over here. Spinning a thread. We twist the fiber on fiber, and the strength of the thread does not reside in the fact that some one fiber runs through the whole length, but in the overlapping of many fibers. So that this idea that all of these parts create something much bigger than themselves, but also this idea that there are these links between so many differences. So, for example, the Pepe family, we can look for family resemblance there. they have one amongst themselves, for sure. There are two pieces to this puzzle. One is that it kind of illustrates a real physiological family resemblance of my father and his siblings and their mother. In fact, I can look at my grandmother's shins and remember crocheting at her feet with her big stockings rolled down around her ankles, and looking at her shins and thinking, Grandma only has like 4 hairs on her shin and otherwise bald. And I didn't say it in that way. I just looked and registered. And I look at my shins and I have Grandma's shins. Very convenient. But there's also another kind of set of resemblance here that is as important as the one driven by DNA, and that is the kind of cultural resemblances that we could look at this and say, well, that's probably about 1957, maybe. That we can read the styles of it, that we can put these bodies into context by the clothing they're wearing, the type of photograph it is, and a variety of other cultural constructions. But as a child, not only did I get the notice about Grandma's shins, but living at feet level, at shin level, you look at what's there. And what I learned as a child was that Aunt Mary lived in New Jersey because she had closed shoes. Auntie Annie lived in Florida because she had open-toe shoes. And Grandma Rose lived half the time in Jersey and the other half the time in Florida. And it made sense to me. And they wore the right kind of shoes to say that to me as a child. We search for these kind of resemblances both in life and every day and in culture. In a twisted way, I think it's something about being Italian. I'm fixated on trying to find the roots past my grandparents. So, of course, I go on Pinterest and find Ludovico Medici's death mask and say, that underbite or overbite, I don't know what it is. That's my father's chin. I might be related to the Medici. Probably not. That's my mother's nose and upper lip, this Roman lady. And that's a gladiator from the Samnites, the people that lived during Rome, during the social wars of Rome, who, of course, they lost, but they're from the region of Italy that I'm from. So there were warriors, at least fratricidal warriors. You know, it's Rome, Romulus and Remus, in my heritage, in my family resemblance, in my chosen culturally constructed family. Which is probably why, when I was a younger woman, I protested it as a radical lesbian feminist. We protested patriarchy with Mary Daly and her friends, and I got to make these women posters, and on the back they said, "Women shout, rage." And there was a time in my youth when being a radical lesbian feminist was more important than making art, actually a big chunk of time. And we followed women like Mary Daly, the kind of wild Reformed Catholic separatist, and Andrea Dworkin, the New Yorker, who wrote quite a bit about rape and patriarchy, and the brilliant Audre Lorde, who taught everyone that it's not enough to learn the master's tools. And we followed them around to find each other and to hear the voices of older women who had more experience and more insight into this thing called feminism and called living as lesbians, and Audre Lorde as a Black lesbian poet, warrior in America. It was a really amazing time, and then I woke up one day and said, I miss art. I can't stand it anymore. Nobody here looks at art. And I can't look at that patriarchal stuff because it's a problem. Mary Daly would tell me, don't look at that stuff. It's not good. And so I would go to the Smith College Museum of Art and say, yes, it is. So I got to work with the collection of the Smith College Museum of Art. And I worked in museums for a long time until it was time for me to go back to graduate school and re-enter the mainstream as someone who had learned a variety of messages, a variety of lessons, and had some messages to deliver myself. So feminists, museums, the Canon, I think we like to invent ourselves now more than ever. Social media is a spectacular tool for that invention, but it's not a spectacular tool for history. And so I think it's really important to become fully acquainted with the canon and about facing the mainstream and entering it is really about wanting to change that canon so that we can be a part of it. So, I had a teacher once that said, if you want to be an artist, you want to affect history. If you don't want to affect history, do something else. And I actually believe that. At a certain point, this is not necessarily about self-expression. Self-expression is the baseline. It's about engaging with a vision or with a dialogue in mind. So chronological histories very much count to me. These are the ones that make sense to me. And it's truly whether I like them or not. Love the work, hate the guy. So, when we don't like them, especially, is when we rightfully work to entangle them with our own new problems. So when I began to crochet, in my mind, Pollock's webs were just like these webs. Is this, anybody remember Sonia Johnson in this crowd? No. Well, look her up. She ran for president against Reagan, the Green Party. She was my Bernie. She was. It was like, if I can't have Sonia, I'm not voting for anybody. Well, that was the last time I ever did that. But before she came to the old Cambridge Baptist Church, in actually Cambridge, Boston, we decorated the podium with what we thought of as lesbian kind of Wicca webs and double axes, and this is perfect, 1980s radical lesbian decor. This is a very particular cultural construct that I do not want to get lost, and this is a big motivation for my work. I thought of Faith Wilding as this woman, the woman who was waiting, the woman who was doing really interesting and strange gender-driven performance art at Woman House. This is a 15-minute monologue, scripted, and she's waiting to be born, and then she's waiting to get breasts, and then she's waiting to have a baby, or she's waiting for a man, and she's waiting. And it's just this monologue of what women were in the 70s talking about in terms of waiting to have a life and not having one of their own. Later, I found out that same Faith Wilding was this Faith Wilding. And what's interesting to me is that I only found out about this piece after I started crocheting. So this is another aspect of history. When you find your natural predecessors after you begin a task in making art, you just have to reach back and figure out what your relationship with them is. You can't go running screaming, somebody stole my art, or I can't do that because somebody already did it. You'll do it differently if you find the relationship, and that's a beautiful thing. And now Faith and I have a lovely relationship in truth because we've shown our work together side by side. This is hot lesbian formalism. I don't really care if you think these are really enormous fishnet stockings or a modernist grid or a chain link fence or lingerie. It's all of the above, and it's a lot of abstract stuff. I look at it and involve myself with it as an abstraction in space. Shoelaces tied together make a really wonderful spiky fence. The black rubber bands is very industrial. They're very industrial. They literally are industrial rubber bands. And they're also kind of hot. Here's Mr. Slit. There is a vein of my work that is quite figurative. This is my update to say response to Faith's work of the womb room. It's a big vaginal doorway with a handmade doormat. Complicated story, but there you have it. So now it's touring with an exhibition of Woman House 2.0 that was organized in Paris and will be at the Women's Museum in DC, which is kind of an interesting location. It's a great museum with an interesting collection, but it's not, maybe it'll be recouped now that we have Me Too and post-Hillary and everything else where we're having another renaissance. But it is kind of a segregated location. It's okay. It'll be interesting to see the work there. So I have a kind of promiscuous practice. And it's riddled with contingencies. And all of them require a special kind of observation and a degree of analysis. And from the family resemblance and the cultural construction and the relationship to history, the way that I understand my work and can make my work is by describing that work over and over again, something like this. Excuse me. An object and a drawing that are contingent, concrete and ephemeral, abstract and representational, and a picture. An object that is a drawing, a picture, and a process, and is ephemeral. A domestic craft, a process, that made an abstract picture that is a window treatment, that is a room divide. Drawings that are objects, contingent objects that are drawings made with latent shadow. Drawings that are works on paper, drawings that are photographs. Photographs that are painterly, which are drawings that are dynamic all over compositions. Contingent drawings that are objects. Objects that are automatically made from ready-mades. Objects that are automatically made, that are handmade, that identify a family resemblance, and create a dynamic field composition. Objects that identify a family resemblance, that are handmade and cast from ready-mades. Objects that include a ready-made, cast from ready-mades, and stands alone. Objects made using a domestic craft to make a drawing that is an ephemeral object that casts shadows to make drawings. The object, the shadow, the drawing. Object made from ready-mades that is a drawing that is a dynamic all-over field composition made using a domestic craft, made by cannibalizing old work, cutting it apart, and putting it back together. A drawing that is a work on paper, which is made by cannibalizing old work, cutting it apart, and putting it back together. A drawing that is a work on paper, which is made by cannibalizing old work, cutting it apart, and putting it back together, that is a dynamic field composition that has a strong referent. The referent. It's a 9th Avenue bridge on the Gowanus Canal. An object that is made by crocheting shoelaces and rubber bands. An object that is made by knotting rubber bands that is a room divide and a drawing. Rubber bands, picture, painting, meatballs, video, painting, plaster, shoelace. So raking over the works to arrive at multiple identities was really not enough. Each work is also made by, in a context, one that I can choose but not often control. So I worked in a place called Beatles Lunch in Boston. It was a lesbian separatist restaurant, and I made these contraptions. It's a little bit of foreshadowing, no? But I made them to be completely utilitarian, you see, because the menus kept falling on the floor. They didn't work at all. I mean, people just looked at them and said, "Can you tell us where the menus are?" I'm like, "They're right there." So, you know, this is the beginning of leaving making art, right? And coming back years later to basically use the same materials, just different. This is one of these control, not control things that you think about years and years later, and that, you know, you realize, oh, I was working with that material before I even thought of working with that material. Even before I thought making things out of crocheting was some strange odd thing to do. Why? Because I was working with light and shadow, and they thought I was a conceptual artist, and they thought that this was just so absolutely fascinating, and the ready-mades and Duchamp and this and that. And I thought in my head, yeah, what if I started crocheting? And then I just thought, oh, I should do that. You know, another time when I was in school, my last review board at Mass Art, I found a textile, and it was called a rug. It spoke of a place called home, and placed handmade triangular bricks onto them, an army of women on rollers, ready to move in an interlocking structure. You know, sometimes I place work in places that will be difficult for me, where I won't be top billing. I won't have the subject matter to myself or stand alone. And that's when I do a project like this. Because it's important to take on that second fiddle location. people in the fashion industry work several times harder than we do. And that's why they make money. That was an education. Amazing. And at the end of the day, you know, I got paid a little bit of money. I got to stay at the Standard Hotel. I made the fastest installation of my life. And then when I got home, I got this amazing bouquet of flowers from the organizer. And I was like, wow, they don't do this in the art world. It's like, no, because nobody's making any money. So, you know, sometimes I like to shift the use of craft to say, you know, this thing that could look like a painting in one place might be pushed back into its utilitarian mode where we would just make a place to hang out on the floor and drink tea and eat cookies and talk in Istanbul, which is totally fun and always serious. One of the things that I love about leaving the country is you can have very long, serious conversations with people, and you don't know any of the local gossip, so there is none, and it's amazing, and people really like to communicate. I think it's also what I like about leaving New York. So in Istanbul, I met the curator of the 8th Shenzhen Sculpture Biennial, and he said, I'm sorry, I don't have any cards left, but would you like to do something like this again in Shenzhen, China? And I was like, yeah, sure. Like, who are you? You know, I thought he was pulling my leg. He was really nice. He was hanging out, and he just seemed really unassuming, just a nice guy, and wanted some tea and cookies, whatever. And he took my information, and I took his. We wrote it down, and we exchanged it. And I wrote to him, and I heard nothing. And then all of a sudden, are you still on? I'm like, yeah, okay, let's get a visa. So we went to Shenzhen and made this place that was an amazing experience for me because it was called for the people, literally for the people. It was a research station where people could hang out and have programming and look at books that all the curators brought from outside of the country, and you know, to see people actually using the work and having fun, and for the very first time in my life, having the work be called cute. My work is cute. Was amazing. So other than that, you know, other than these excursions outside of these experimental zones, outside of the main frame of what I consider the infiltration of gallery space with something that relates to a domestic craft, and women's work, and soft ephemeral things. You know, this is it. This is the original concept, is to go into these white boxes and infiltrate it with this craft and with things like color and an optical immersion in something that is actually 3 dimensions. It's structural and temporary, and you can know that simply by looking at the object in its relationship to the architecture. This has got to go away in a particular way because it was made in a particular way, and unless there's another room with a wall in the middle of it, it's not ever going to happen again like this. Camp out in the white box with a really huge tent. This is me and Carrie Moyer and 2 women scribbling through space with over 1,700 pounds of nautical tow line, and working with Ball Nogus and PS1 for a warm-up. And again, the Common Sense series started here, where my formalist construction was taken away by a series of knitting lessons. common sense, and Tbilisi the most successful iteration of the project because the women there actually wanted the materials very much. And because everybody there knew how to do this stuff. This is my favorite image. Look at those guys. I'm sure they're like on a date. And the guy, he's crocheting. The girl has her hand on her hip. Woman. But there are children doing it. My friends in Briga in Italy, where they laughed at my wool from America. I know, right? You know what that means. Yes, they said, oh, katana? And I was like, no, it's wool. And they're like, no. So I'm going to try to take you quickly out of this so we have some time to talk. Hopefully I've turned around and thrown these wild things at you in terms of like showing you how I think and the randomness of it, the lines through it, the twisting threads of it. Now I'm going to bring you through this other body of work that has always gone on behind the scenes and is now coming to light through the show. And then I'm going to quickly bring you through just a little path through the show as it was, the hot mess formalism as it was in Phoenix. And then talking, okay? Okay. So here are the doppelgangers. The doppelgangers and the drawings get taken apart. 1994, 1997, 1999, 2002, 2005. Okay, it's a drawing, but it's a kind of a thing. 2008, 2012, 2014, 2015, 2017, this one, that one, that one. So I need to have multiple sites of operation just to think. I can't really do one without the other very easily, or I get stuck. There are different bodies of work that have to happen simultaneously, and they talk to each other. All right, so here's the show. It's always nice to see your name in big vinyl letters on the wall. So that is a piece from 1983, Women Are Bricks, that we remade for the exhibition because it was completely lost. And it was an object that very easily could last forever, and I wanted it to. The only reason why it didn't last forever is that the last time I made it, I was like 20 years old, and I didn't have any place to put all that stuff. And I didn't think it counted, so I put all the bricks in the backyard and gave the rug to an old roommate. It's remarkable how much it looks the same. Drawings, Second Vatican Council wrap around the other side. This is part of 91 BCE. Not a good year for emperors. Moving up in space. There's what ended up to be my map of the United States in chainmail. See how big the Northeast is? Really big. You guys are somewhere over there. From above, you see the map is down there in the back corner. Here's Put Me Down Gently in its configuration for this show. The impetus for the drawing in space was to actually put lines up against the walls of this skylight space. When you look up into that space without any lines contouring the angles of the walls, it just looks like a flat tonal painting. You can't see the dimensionality unless you understand the architecture and look really hard. So it's the first time that a number of people actually understood that piece of the architecture, which in the very beginning was the pay attention, there's always this kind of pay attention to the architecture part of the installation, and that was the thing that was most important to me. That there's light up there at the end of the tunnel. So upstairs, the orange you see is a reinstallation of Red Hook at Bedford Terrace, piece in the Smith College Museum collection. And there, that big loop, there's a lot of shadow play in the space, which is really fun. And I worked with great lighting technicians where they were actually laying down, we were going back and forth. I was laying down lines, and then they were laying down shadows, or they were laying down shadows, and I was laying down lines against. It was a real back and forth collaboration kind of thing. And the nautical tow line on the second floor, a very different installation of this piece. And looking back across to Put Me Down Gently, where we got to make a secondary horizontal drawing above the video space. Tables of the entire set of things are called votive moderns, and it's because the size of these things are the size of the sculpture that I grew up with, which is basically Mary and the Infant of Prague and the Sacred Heart of Jesus. That fits on your dresser. Like, that's what I thought sculpture was, and that's what I still think sculpture is. It's an old Roman thing, actually. Catholics just stole it from the Romans. And then the drawings on the far side, you see the Ayn Rand, the famous Ayn Rand symbol of the United States, the interlocking U and S that makes a dollar bill. That's from a show in 2007 called Mein Ein. I was thinking ahead. And then more, some from the series of different things. And then on the far side, you see 2007 was a really good year. What I called then glass ceiling drawings, and I made because I got a full-time job. A full-time job I no longer have. That's good news. And then videos from the 90s. And here we are back at that image that's like this image that I just keep looping back and back to. So this last piece is a little teaser for my return. Something I plan to do at the M is a little, I was going to call it pole dancing, but that's not appropriate. A little maypole dancing without the maypole, a method of braiding a derby rope, where you just go back and forth until you get really dizzy and all the rope is gone. There you have it. All right. Did I wear you out? No. Little random thoughts here and there. Hope you have a lot of questions. Anything?
What's next?
Well, the M is next. It's the reinstallation of this work. So Put Me Down Gently, 91 BCE, and Red Hook at Bedford Terrace all will change their shape and considerably in each location. We're going to make 91 BCE really small, make something else disappear. It's really about each of the architectural locations and the conversation I have with the curator on deck. And that's the fun part of just showing how much a shapeshifter a textile can be, and do the different things and say different things in response to the place and the space. And I think a lot more objects have a ton of ideas. I just need some time. But it'll take me a year to get through this process, so I have time. There's a question in the back there?
You said at one point that we'd like to invent ourselves now more than ever.
Yeah.
And you also said that self-expression is the baseline, fantastic. I'm wondering what advice you might give to somebody working in contemporary art now regarding staying engaged with like a larger context, a larger like societal and cultural context.
Mm-hmm.
In a time when there is so much focus on like personal branding and like
That's what I have to say about your question. This is a great question. Your mind is exactly in the right, like the problem you've set up by this question is exactly the right problem. I think the most important thing to remember is that originality doesn't work in the same way for you guys than it did for my generation. My generation was, is there such a thing as originality? And then the market spoke back to us and said, no, but yes. Right? There was the market conversation, and branding went off in that direction. Like nothing you do needs to be original, but you need really good branding, right? And then there was this other part of the conversation that said, no, originality not in the way it's been sold to us, but there is something specific about every one of us, and that is the culture you grew up in. Not like I grew up in America, but I grew up with somebody who always used purple and green when she made Afghans. Why? I have no idea, you know, or I grew up with pasta every Sunday. Like, I grew up with something that's not particular always to my family, but is interlocking with larger cultures that I can track, right? So really knowing where you come from, not just in terms of 20th century art, but in terms of long lineages of like intergenerational or intragenerational trauma and intergenerational culture, right? And then not doing the like, I have a personal relationship to this thing. Of course you do. But not only do I have a personal relationship with this stuff, there are people I don't even know that have a personal relationship with this stuff. And that's my audience, right? So it's really knowing yourself and also really knowing the common ground of the big culture piece and of the whatever else, of the craft piece, the painting piece, understand how the art world works at large, understand the relationship between art and design and craft. Those are real locations with very particular networks, family resemblance of relationships. And the other thing is learn history and keep up with current events. That's all very hard. And you can't do all of it at the same time, but it's a cyclical thing. And have the confidence of your convictions and also absorb as many questions people have for you as possible. Be better at asking yourself questions than anybody around you. Good luck. Yeah. Yeah, hi. I'm thinking about historical things. I also, I listen to a lot of lectures. I listen to books, like I listen to long books and long lecture series. And I'm learning so much more than I ever did when I had to read, because I was never a good reader. I would read all that French theory, man, over and over again. You know, all that Heidegger, and then I realized, yeah, nobody's going to understand this stuff unless you're a philosophy student and you know. I was in the generation of a lot of theory, but no context for the theory, which is what that is. You know, it's like a map without any context unless you know where it already is. And I think it's a problem that we live we live in this country and we don't know anything about Central Asia, which is basically, you know, the steppes, Iran, Afghanistan, places that we're very involved in right now, that has brought us to, you know, mathematics and astronomy well before anybody in the Mediterranean knew anything. Like very important, enriching places that have long histories, long complicated histories that have little to do with what's going on right now with the United States. And we don't know how to place them. And it seems like such a metaphor for the pieces that we miss as artists when we're only looking at our own neighborhood. So literally, I would like you to know what Central Asia's cultures are, and I think this is a good idea. I think we all know it's important that we know about China now, and I think we've known that we need to know about Japan and Korea as citizens of the world since the Second World War. But I think Central Asia is one of those places that doesn't have any grip for us, and I think should, in a historical sense. And then it has so many other metaphors for me in terms of what we do see, what we can recognize, what we can't recognize. So that's the unpacking. Thanks for the question. See ya. Yes.
I was wondering if you could talk a bit more about showing in different spaces. Like, for instance, you showed at that fashion
Yeah.
pop-up store kind of thing. And because when you were talking about your smaller sculptures, they were kind of, you mentioned they were ephemeral and avoided consumption. And I was just wondering, kind of like, yeah, there's like these opportunities to get paid and do
Mm-hmm.
in other contexts, but how does that, like, did you find that affected your work, or like how you thought of it?
Yeah. So it's if you look carefully at the different works, I mean, I think it's a kind of a craft reading issue. So any of the work with light and a wall drawing, there is a way to reconstruct that, but my decision was to not reconstruct it, and so those were ephemeral. Many of the installations that were only fiber, actually all of them except for the ones in the exhibition, maybe one or two others that are in other collections, were completely cannibalized for new work. And so it was this idea of giving you something extremely physical that appeared at first glance to be saleable, but because of the way that it was in that particular space, it would be impossible. I mean, it would be such an enormous enterprise to recreate it for sale. That wasn't the point. And I did that because when I was coming up as an artist, there was a false dichotomy between conceptual work and physical work, between ideas and handmade things. Like, a lot of conceptual work presented itself as either purely ready-made or high-end fabrication or text or something else, but definitely not crafted. And that was bullshit, you know? And that was the thing I just really wanted to nail down. And I didn't really think about anything else. And in the beginning, I did sell some installations to people. I was shocked. You know, we made a certificate, we sold them. The little objects by themselves, the votive, moderns, always sold. The drawings, I always sold. But you should know, those are really small markets. And I didn't really sell that many. A lot of them went to, like, fundraisers. I sold a lot of work in fundraisers. Thousands of dollars of work in fundraisers. But so I've made my money mostly. I've sold a number of drawings. It's really nice, but it's not, that's not the core of the work. So the way I make work is doing stuff like this, going and talking and teaching gigs and visiting lectures, and I like and always have felt like teaching is, having a conversation is what all the stuff is for. But I can say it wasn't completely a wise decision. You know, there's a tremendous risk to it. And I have this luxury of like basically having a life of showing in museums and not-for-profits and Kunsthalles and traveling around the world and having cool residencies and having a lot of it paid for or breaking even or making a little bit of money. But two things, I still have my education debt and I don't have much of a retirement. So I have to make this change between now and 70-something, right? My art career was developed in a radically different time than is now. But ironically, if you want to do something like this risky, you probably could, again, because the route to the top 1% of artists is a very, very difficult route right now, almost impossible route unless you are going to like one of 3 places. And not that you can't beat the odds. And the number of teaching jobs will probably dwindle in the next few years, or maybe already is happening. And the things that my generation imagined was the future of making art economically doesn't happen the same way anymore. Does this answer your question?
No, that's it. I guess I was wondering more particularly the context of showing your work, like the fashion.
Oh, that was? Okay, how did I get that gig? The shoe designer had, probably still has, a press person. The press person was a former student of mine in the grad painting department at RISD. And she said, Sheila, do you want to do this cool thing? Because his father was a shoemaker and he designed shoes, and your grandfather was, and you do this thing with shoelaces, and we want to come